Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, Piotr. It's really such a pleasure to be here as part of this conversation and to bring this small offering of the work that I do with so many colleagues on refugee issues into this conversation on the grand split. As Brian mentioned, the topic, the title of my paper is The Shifting Politics of Asylum in a Dividing World. And the politics of asylum has been something that's animated my work and the work of colleagues with whom I've worked very closely for a number of years. And it's so refreshing to think about the evolving politics of refugee responses in this framework of a grand split and a dividing world. And so I'm happy to share some of the reflections that I have on this. But like Laura did in her presentation, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather here as the stolen land of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And I say that not only out of courtesy, but out of a recognition that these issues of dislocation and dispossession that animate my work are not something that only happens in the parts of the world that I'll be talking about. It's very much woven into the history of the land where we are. I also want to acknowledge my own positionality as a white male tenured academic with permanent legal status here in Canada who's never experienced displacement. And I want to recognize how much of what I share with you comes out of dozens of hours of conversation with those who've experienced displacement and those who live and work in the context of displacement itself, primarily within the global south. So what you see before you is someone who is part of conversations with many and a messenger of many perspectives. I don't claim to represent it all. So what I want to do in my presentation is to draw on the case of what we call the global refugee regime and to use it as a site where we can both observe and hopefully explain this phenomenon called the grand split. And what I will argue is the dynamics that we observe today have been building for decades. That this is not a specific episode. And what we need to do is to understand this phenomenon, this process, in a much longer historical context. And so I'll be telling the story as a story of three acts. And so the point that I want us to take away is that, Hans Martin, to the extent that you say that there's this obsession with this moment of crisis. We talk about the refugee crisis, the crisis in asylum, that what we're experiencing right now is a manifestation of structural change that we have been experiencing since the very beginning of this thing called the refugee regime itself. And similar to Piotr's arguments and comments at the beginning of the workshop, I'll be arguing that the grand split is not producing a new set of binaries, east, west, north, south. But really what this is a process of fragmentation. It's a process of fragmentation through which the positions that are present in conversations of the functioning of this thing called a regime, what many would call the myth of the regime, that we're experiencing this fragmentation at a time where the positions become much more fluid and much more volatile. So what this means is it makes the practice of international cooperation, it makes the practice of global governance arrangements much more reliable, which creates a certain feedback loop. That with the unreliability of collective responses, that contributes to a further fragmentation as states see less and less value in remaining committed to global regimes and existing norms. But echoing what Laura said in her presentation, if we limit ourselves to thinking about states as the only actor within these dynamics, we miss a very important part of the action. I'm going to keep myself to 15 minutes, but in the Q&A time, I'd love to talk about how non-state actors, especially refugee-led organizations and refugee-led initiatives, are navigating this much more fluid and volatile terrain with extraordinary success. So let's begin in Act 1. And Act 1 of this story begins in the aftermath of World War II, where there were some 55 million people displaced in Europe and several competing refugee response regimes, the International Refugee Organization and others. But the decision arose that these other institutions were insufficient in responding to the needs of these people displaced in Europe after World War II. And what emerged from that was a discussion of a new international organization and a new set of norms that became the regime in the form of the institution, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the norms that are contained within the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. There were two very distinct competing visions at the time of what this regime would look like. What would this institution be mandated to do? What would these norms be? And it's fascinating to note that these competing visions replicate some of the, the imperial post-colonial dichotomies that are easily pointed to as explaining the divisions today. That essentially we had India and Pakistan, recently independent, who in the process of independence and the partition in 1957 experienced the displacement of some 10 million people. And India and Pakistan and those states with that perspective and history who were independent at the time in 1949, 1950, they argued for an organization and a regime that was deeply political, that recognized the political roots of displacement and the need for an organization that had the capacity to vault over the sovereignty of states to prescribe what solutions should be assigned for particular refugee categories. The other view was held very much by the United States and its allies, who in the very early days of the Cold War saw assistance to refugees as far too politically important to cede to an international organization. Now, in the history then unfolds that the United States got its way, that the refugee regime was founded on these principles of retaining state sovereignty at the core. UNHCR is a non-political organization. It cannot engage in prescribing solutions for particular refugee situations, and it's reliant on the voluntary contributions of states. But the deal was struck that refugee assistance in the early days of the Cold War was so politically valuable to the United States that it said, we will be the champions of these norms of refugee protection, paramount of which is the norm of non-refoulement, that refugees shall not be forcibly returned to a state where they fear persecution. But the flip side of that deal is the United States would foot the bill. As a matter of foreign policy, the United States gives more than 30% of contributions to the UN's Refugee Agency. And as a matter of protocol, the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees is always an American. And so what this created was a very particular bargain at the core of the regime. The regime was sustained by this contribution of political support from the United States, funding support from the United States and its allies. And this led, at the end of the Cold War, to comprehensive solutions to major refugee situations, such as those in Indochina and Central America. And, of course, the funding of refugee warriors and those refugees in exile who are fighting against contested communist regimes. The consensus collapsed in the aftermath of the Cold War. And here I am on 8 minutes, starting Act 2. What happened, that's a little cue to you, Brian.
We're on Act 2.
There we go, Act 2. The consensus collapsed at the end of the Cold War, really around a number of facts. Number one, the political utility of refugees, refugee warriors during the Cold War, that political utility evaporated. Number two, that the rise in conflicts in the aftermath of the Cold War meant that the number of people displaced in the world grew, exponentially. So there was a significant rise in the number of people needing support from the global refugee regime. But at this time of increased need, it was not matched by sustained engagement by the United States and its allies. That resources required to respond to the needs of refugees were directed elsewhere. But critically, it wasn't just in the question of funding, it was in the question of moral authority and the enacting of those norms that the United States and Western states were seeking to project in other parts of the world. It was in the aftermath of the Cold War, actually by 1988, when the UK started to impose visa requirements on individuals coming from Sri Lanka of Tamil origin, that we see Western states responding to this rise in global asylum numbers by imposing containment policies, visa requirements, policies of extraterritorialization, border controls and decreased funding. And so it was at this moment where demand was increasing that Western states who had forged the refugee regime in an image that they wanted to reproduce, that they backed away. But then also at exactly the same time that many states in the global south that hosted more than 80% of the world's refugees were themselves facing the pressures of economic liberalization and democratization. And so Act 2 concludes with states in the global south facing pressures of containment, pressures of numbers, pressures of structural adjustment and economic liberalization, and trying to act as a bloc to push back. In 1997, India introduced a conclusion at UNHCR's executive committee calling for new principles about burden and responsibility sharing. And at that time, they were able to marshal the entire G77 to act as one within the executive committee. Act 3, that consensus of the G77 begins to collapse. It begins to collapse through the 2000s, but certainly by 2015. It collapses by 2015 when European states themselves were unable to act collectively in response to the demands of some 1 million people seeking asylum in Europe. That was the moment where the gig was up. It was no longer possible for Europeans to say we can act collectively to maintain our borders and and export asylum. They also lost their moral authority in speaking to governments like Lebanon, like Jordan, like Kenya, like Tanzania, like Bangladesh, like Thailand. When European states said you need to uphold principles of protection, where the representatives in those political communities say we have access to the internet, we see what you're doing. Why can't we do what you're doing? And so what this resulted in my last 3 minutes, is this thrust of this hyperactivity from 2015 to 2016, with the New York Declaration in 2016, from 2016 to 2018, the negotiation of a global compact on refugees, where southern states who hosted 85% of the world's refugees were trying very hard to say what new commitments can we extract from the global south in terms of refugee resettlement, in terms of guarantees of funding. The fact was nothing. Perfect. Time's up. 25 minutes? 12. Okay. I'm new to the iPhone. I thought the timer was much more accurate than that. And what we saw out of this process of trying to negotiate this global compact in 2016 to 2018 was the ultimate fracturing of positions on behalf of those global south states who up until then had this unified position. First of all, it's interesting to note how actors such as China and Russia engaged in the process of negotiating a global compact. It was very much that insistence that principles of sovereignty were fundamental in any new agreement on refugee responses. But you then had these major refugee hosting states take very, very different approaches. Where Kenya said, let's make a deal with the World Bank, and neighboring Tanzania saying, we don't want to have anything to do with this, go away. You had Lebanon saying, you've done everything you've asked of us, then why can't we get more money? And you had Jordan as a very comfortable rentier state. You had states in Latin America, such as Colombia, who naturalized or regularized Venezuelan migrants on its territory, recognizing that we have to engage in dialogue with the United States about migration, but we can't trust them. We can't rely on them. So we need to find regional arrangements that are going to work, such as the Cartagena Plus 40 process that we see right now. States in the Sahel who have completely backed away from the international organizations and the reliance of cooperation with Western states for much more, for other responses that we can discuss in the question time. And behind all of this, in the promise through a new comprehensive refugee response framework, a promise of access to more resources through the World Bank, through overseas development assistance, through concessional loans, is the promise of China, as we heard in Isaac's presentation, of offering to construct the infrastructure with fewer strings and questions about human rights on the territories of states. So this brings me to my conclusion, that we can no longer talk about the G77 as a block of countries and the way they behave within the refugee regime. That Western states no longer have the moral authority that they had, and they are violating the very norms that they are asking others to uphold. And so what we see within the refugee regime is not only the splintering of the global south as a bloc, the G77 as a bloc, but we see the consequences of the erosion of moral authority of those states that created the very norms and institutions that are now being sought to be upheld. And when in preparing these talks and thinking about this topic, I realized that it provides a much deeper understanding of how the grand split is playing out in one particular context, in one particular site of governance. That the norms and the institutions of the regime are being strained not only by the levels of displacement, which is what we often point to, but they're being strained by the politics of the regime itself. And I think this helps explain the grand split. It helps illustrate the grand split. But it also then gives us lessons in understanding how we then try and respond to issues of displacement. How we not only explain it, but how we respond to it. That where we see that states only invest in the refugee regime if they feel they get a return on that investment. And we can no longer assume that states will turn to global institutions to help solve collective challenges. So the norms and the institutions of the regime, they only work when they're supported. And that is the reality that we've seen through the history of the regime. So this does point to a way forward in terms of where and how we engage with interests, why it talks about the importance of localized knowledge in not only studying the refugee regime, but in providing the evidence for solutions. It really highlights the importance of refugee participation, the engagement of civil society and refugees themselves in these new collective localized responses. And it really points to the opportunity that we see in regional organizations as a site for opportunity, as we've seen in IGAD, in the East Africa community, ECOWAS before everything happened in ECOWAS, and in other regions as well. I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.